All right. Well, today I wanted to go through a guide on hair transplants. There are a lot of things I wish I was told before I got my first hair transplant. When you're getting absolutely demolished by the Norwood Reaper, it can be a very emotionally devastating experience. And I want to go over some best practices when navigating hair transplants in this industry. I remember when my hair loss started getting really bad, and I definitely felt hopeless to say the least. Losing your hair, especially your hairline at a young age, makes you definitely go through an identity crisis. At least it did for me. What I would say is that you got to realize you're not alone, and millions of guys deal with hair loss. Like literally billions of guys over the course of time have dealt with this. So it's not just you. By the age of 35, at least 2/3 of men will experience some degree of hair loss. The first step is, I know it's hard to do, when you look in the mirror and you see your hairline going back, or you see those strands of hairs in your bathtub. It is not a pretty sight. But really, the first step is just trying to put it into context, taking a deep breath, and know that you have options. It's 2023. You have much, much better options than you did even 10 years ago. For context, I've had 2 hair transplants in the past. Back in 2014, I had an FUT procedure, and then in 2017, I had an FUE procedure. I can tell you both of these hair transplants changed my life dramatically, and both I can say were great investments. Some of the best investments I've ever made, to be honest. Investing in your appearance, especially if you've experienced, being bald like myself. I'm telling you, it'll pay for itself over time, and it definitely did. But prior to my first hair transplant, I was about a Norwood 4 with a really bad receding hairline and a crown that was thinning as well. So at this point, I'd shaved my head and I kept my hair pretty much buzzed for at least a year. And towards the later half of the year, I was wearing baseball caps pretty much frequently everywhere I went. I was back in college at the time, so I was able to kind of get away with this. But it really got to the point where I decided to make the jump and start looking into hair transplants. Even back in 2014, this was a very tough industry to navigate. It was really hard to tell who the good surgeons were at the time and what to look out for. There wasn't really a show that I could remember on YouTube that I really watched where they were giving, really good guidance when it came to hair transplants. I was able to find Spencer Coburn's YouTube channel like years down the road, like in 2016, but I didn't even know that was a real show in 2014. So back then, I was just very lost when it came to getting my hair back. So the first place I went was to a local hair club, thinking that they offer hair transplants, and they do offer transplants, but the salesman at the time, he was trying to hard sell me a hair system, when I was in my early 20s at the time. And honestly, I almost got roped into it because he was telling me during the session that, he could get my hairline back, I could have thick hair again, and, of course, saying, hey, the ladies are gonna, love you with this new hair system. You're gonna look great. I almost got roped into it. I was very close to signing that paper and, ordering that hair system. But luckily, I ended up getting out of there and telling him the classic, hey, I'll think about it and get back to you. And it was kind of, that was like my first big wake up call into this industry. And I'll say, hair transplantation it's a $1 billion industry, and for good reason. At the end of the day, some people can pull off the ball look, much better than others. Obviously, if you're Dwayne The Rock Johnson, or you're Jason Statham or Vin Diesel, obviously you can pull it off a little bit better than, most people. Or if you're someone who just, has really good bone structure, is tall, has a good body, has everything else kind of together, they can pull off the bald look much better than, a lot of the rest of us. But at the end of the day, I think everyone looks better with hair, even Dwayne The Rock Johnson. But after I almost got roped into hair club, I ended up going to YouTube, and I was just typing in hair transplants. And I found a surgeon in South Florida that had really good marketing. Like their channel at the time had really, really good marketing. Some of the videos they used were of, people that had really strong hair, had a really good donor hair. They had like strong, dark, ropey hair. And I would see these videos and I was hooked. I was like, I want to go to this surgeon. This is who I want to do it with. And I remember reaching out to them and basically, telling at the time, like I was still in college, like I couldn't even really afford a hair transplant. So, I actually took out a personal loan from like a credit union to pay for my first hair transplant. And it was just a very scary experience. I was more excited to quote unquote get my hair back. But, going into it, I really had no idea how the hair transplant industry worked. And, hair transplant industry, it's a lot of smoke and mirrors at the end of the day. And if you're going to do a hair transplant, I highly recommend that, you really think long and hard about it. And you really need to make sure you can financially afford it. Because I can say for the next, 2 years, I was paying that back, and I was paying it back in interest. Back in college, I was not a financially savvy person. And I will say you want to make sure you can definitely afford it because it's not cheap. Hair transplants, they're not necessarily the most expensive thing in the world, depending on where you go. But I would definitely make sure that you're comfortable with surgery, you're comfortable with having a scar, and you're comfortable with the amount of money it's going to cost. So, if you've decided that you can financially afford a hair transplant and you're comfortable with you're comfortable getting surgery, the first place I would go is the International Alliance of Hair Restoration Surgeons website. I also want to mention that you need to make the best decision for yourself. Hair transplants are not something to take lightly. It's surgery and it'll leave a scar in the back of your head. And you really, really need to think long and hard about going this route. Please do not let this video or really any salesperson in the hair transplant industry hard sell you into getting a hair transplant. It should be a very well-informed decision that you make after a long time of thinking about this, if this is the right decision for you. Once you get a hair transplant, you have the scar, there's no going back. So if you're more comfortable shaving your head, then you'll always have that option. And honestly, more power to you. All right. Well, the IAHRS, the International Alliance of Hair Restoration Surgeons, this is an organization of just basically elite doctors who have been vetted by their peers. Not every surgeon can get in this alliance. These are the best of the best doctors who are not only judged by their skill and expertise in hair transplants, but are also held to a code of ethics. Now, are there going to be hair transplant surgeons not in the IAHRS? Absolutely. However, the IAHRS is the most recognized alliance of expert hair transplant surgeons. There are IAHRS hair transplant surgeons in every part of the US, as well as Europe and other parts of the world. My first surgeon, as I mentioned, was not in the IAHRS. I was lucky to still have a decent result, but I can say my second surgeon who I had gone back to tighten up the hairline, fill in more density in the front, he was a part of the IAHRS, and I can tell you the amount of expertise and detail that he went into, not just in drawing the hairline, but really detailing me every step of the way, what grafts he's using in the front, what grafts he's using behind, the level of detail and expertise that this surgeon had, which led me to have a much, much better result than the surgeon in Florida, I can say was well worth it. Yeah, I spent a little bit more, but at the end of the day, it was well worth the result. The next step before getting a hair transplant is to get on some preventative medicines. Now, you've got everything from minoxidil foam, oral minoxidil. There's the low light lasers that you can buy online. And then there's finasteride. Now, I've taken minoxidil, I've taken finasteride, even used a laser for about a year. And I could say, finasteride is the one that really helped in slowing down my hair loss and even regrowing some of my hair in my crown, a little bit on my mid scalp. I'm not going to say that minoxidil didn't work, but to be honest, when I used minoxidil, I don't think it was super effective. I think it can be effective when you pair it with finasteride, but finasteride is the main medication that's going to help in slowing down your hair loss or potentially regrowing the hair. This is all going to depend on genetics, but basically finasteride is the drug that is responsible for, lowering your DHT levels. And finasteride does this by basically, lowering the amount of testosterone that gets converted to dihydrotestosterone or DHT. But really you want to get on some preventative treatments before you get a hair transplant, because the last thing you want to do is get a hair transplant and then not take finasteride or not use any sort of preventative treatments. And you're most likely just going to continue to lose hair. And you could actually end up looking worse than, what you did before you got the hair transplant. Because, once you get the hair transplant, it doesn't matter if you got FEW or if you got FUT, you're going to have a scar. And you really need to think long and hard before getting a hair transplant on, if you really want to do this, because there's no shame in, shaving your head and going on with life. Like, even if, you don't have, a great head shape or you don't have, good facial features, this is a personal decision that everyone needs to make. And, you ideally, if you're going to get a hair transplant, you want to be on some sort of preventative treatment. When it comes to lasers, to be honest, I know they are approved, but I haven't seen many studies of these laser combs or laser helmets, showing improvements in the hair quality of men. Maybe I just haven't seen them, but I honestly think they're just a way for people to make a lot of money, whether it's in affiliate marketing or whether it's these companies, building these lasers and then, kind of pitching them to you as if they're going to regrow your hair. I would go to your doctor or go to your hair transplant surgeon in your area and have them take a look at your hair and, have them prescribe you finasteride if that is something the doctor feels is best for you, especially if you're going to go down that hair transplant route. Now, something to consider with finasteride is that it can cause side effects in a small minority of men. I know about 1 to 3% of men get sexual side effects after taking finasteride. And this is also something you should think about. And, when you're taking finasteride, this is another reason why you should get on some preventative treatments before opting for a hair transplant. Mainly because if your body doesn't react well to finasteride, then the hair transplant route may not be for you. Because if you're getting side effects like erectile dysfunction, low libido, other sexual problems, where it's really affecting your livelihood, then, finasteride may not be for you. There's definitely been a lot of men out there it's been documented, whether through YouTube videos or for forums, that, they're suffering from these persistent side effects even after taking finasteride. And it's definitely something that you should take into consideration and see if your body can handle finasteride, and, talk to your hair transplant surgeon about, how you feel on the medication and, what dosage you should be on. That's got to be a part of the conversation, and that's got to be part of your hair transplant strategy well before you get a hair transplant. Because, let's just say the first couple months you respond well to finasteride and you're not seeing side effects, and you go and get a hair transplant, and then a couple months down the road you start experiencing sexual side effects, or the other side effects that are, frequently reported, such as, dizziness, depression, breast enlargement, those types of side effects. You want to be mindful of that. You don't want to ever rush into a hair transplant surgery, because if your body doesn't respond well to the medication, then you're just going to be left with a big scar. Yeah, you'll be left with more hair, but if the rest of your hair continues to fall out, it's not going to look good in the long run. So this is probably one, and this is something that a lot of hair transplant surgeons and other people won't tell you about, is they don't usually like to talk about finasteride and the potential for side effects. I've been really lucky. I haven't really experienced any major side effects from taking finasteride. And of course, the side effects that you're experiencing, they could be psychological, but they also could be due to the drug as well. So it's always something you want to kind of keep in the back of your head, in weighing out, whether or not you should get a hair transplant. So once you get on some preventative treatments like finasteride or minoxidil, you want to kind of see your hair transplant surgeon and really kind of see where you're at. Now, in my opinion, and I'm not a hair transplant surgeon, but I think if you've reached the Norwood 5 level, as you can see on the screen, where you've got aggressive thinning in the back, in the crown, and you have really bad receding hairline, getting a hair transplant, it really may not be for you. You may already be too gone by that point. It might take 3 procedures for you to even see a decent head of hair. So you really need to figure out what stage of the Norwood scale you're on and what your goals are going forward. If you're in the Norwood 1 stage, where you just have a very, very slight receding hairline, a hair transplant may not be for you. Your hair loss hasn't advanced to a point where it's even noticeable to the outside world. Like, yeah, it sucks even when your hairline goes back, a millimeter. It's not a good feeling. But even with Norwood 2, when you start to develop, a decent receding hairline, this may not be the time to get a hair transplant, because you just don't know how much your hair how much your hair you're going to lose going forward. But once you start getting in the Norwood 3, Norwood 4 range, this is where I think you should start potentially looking at getting a hair transplant, because this is really the stage where it becomes noticeable to the outside world, to people around you, to women. And if you feel self-conscious, whether it's about your receding hairline or about the thinning in your crown, getting on preventative treatments is the first step. But the second step is to really gauge where you are and really figure out what your goals are going to be. Because I think there's really, 2 major decisions when it comes to the hair loss that you have on your head. The first one is, do you want to fix, the frontal part of your hair? Do you want to fix the hairline? Or does the crown bother you more? Now, for most people, the receding hairline or thinning in the front is going to bother them the most, because, they see that when they look in the mirror, when they're sitting across the table from someone, people are going to notice that more than, the thinning in your crown. But you really want to go in with a goal set before you even have the hair loss consultation with one of the surgeon's salespeople. You really want to go in with a goal. And the reason I say this is because you don't want to let a salesman tell you what you should get, tell you the direction you should take your hair. You really want to go in with a plan and specifically say, hey, I've looked at the Norwood scale. I know I'm about a Norwood 4. My goal is to restore my hairline, get some density in the front, and I'm just going to use finasteride for the crown, and I'll use Topic or I'll use Heratin in the crown to fill that area in. You need to go in with that kind of mindset, because there's going to be a lot of nasty salesmen who will try to tell you what you should do with your hair and try to upsell you on getting more grafts to cover the hairline and the crown. You really need to go in there with the mindset of, this is my hair and this is my life, and not let any salesperson try to talk you into something that is going to cost you more money and may not be right for you. So after you've determined where you are on the Norwood scale, you really want to determine which procedure you should get. And this is really where the hair transplant surgeon really needs to give his thoughts on, because some people may really be good candidates for FUE, which is follicular unit extraction, and other people are going to be better candidates for follicular unit transection, FUT. So essentially, on my first hair transplant, I got 2,000 grafts of FUT, and then on my second transplant, I got 2,000 grafts of FUE. Now with FUT, they will create a linear scar, and they'll take the grafts from the back of your head, sometimes on the side of your head. They take it in a very specific zone, but ultimately you're left with a larger scar. Depending on the surgeon, the scar may be much less gruesome than other surgeons. Luckily, the scar that I had from my first surgeon, it's definitely noticeable if I were to get a buzz cut, or if I were to get my hair cut really short. But I've seen really, really bad linear scars that honestly make people look disfigured. Whereas with FUE, basically what the surgeon does is he goes in the back of the head in a specific zone, and he takes out basically individual grafts from the back of your head, and then places them in the frontal zone or your crown. And FUE tends to be a little bit more expensive than FUT is. I know for the doctor, the surgeon that I went to for my second hair transplant, I know FUE grafts were, I believe, $1 more expensive than FUT grafts. But the key here is to really, talk to your surgeon and get his expert opinion on what you should get. Normally, when someone has more significant hair loss, FUT is used for the first transplant, because they can basically take out more grafts than FUE, and typically resulting in restoring more of your hair than what they could get, transecting using the FUE method. Two factors to keep in mind before getting a hair transplant are your hair color and your hair density. So the way this plays out is, I can give you many examples, but the biggest example I can give is the contrast between your hair color and your skin tone. So let's just say you have like light blonde hair. You're a blonde guy with fair skin, and you get, let's just say, 2,000 grafts of FUT. Now, because there's less of a contrast between your hair and your skin tone, your hair transplant is just going to look a little bit better than, say, someone who has, thinner, wispy, kind of darker hair, because their hair density isn't as strong, and the contrast between, their dark hair and their fair skin is very stark. So their hair transplant, they can get those same 2,000 FUT grafts, but the hair transplant is most likely not going to look as good as, say, the blonde guy's is. Now, in the contrast, let's just say you're a guy, you're a dark-haired guy, and you have tanner skin. In addition to that, you have dark, ropey, strong type hair. You can get those same 2,000 FUT grafts in your hair transplant because of the thickness of your hair and because of the the less of a contrast between your tan skin and your dark hair, your hair transplant may come out looking amazing. So this is just something, I'm not saying this to stop you if you have, thinner hair type and, darker hair, but it's just something to be mindful of going in, just to not necessarily expect the world. If you're a Norwood 4 and you're trying to restore your hairline and, you have, thinner hair and, really dark hair at the same time, you can still get a good result, but you have to be mindful of how good it's going to look. And you might have to go back and get a second procedure to really fill in those gaps, to really give you that strong look that you're looking for. When you go to the IAHRS website, there's going to be a feature where you can find a doctor. And there's many doctors in each state, in a lot of the states in the United States, as well as Europe, Turkey, Canada, India, Asia, the Caribbean. Ideally, I think in an ideal world, you want to find a surgeon that's relatively close to you. If you live on the West Coast, you ideally should look for a surgeon that's on the West Coast. If you're on the East Coast, the same thing. And then if you're in Europe, you ideally want to find a surgeon that's not too far from you. I think there's a lot of people who always talk about how Turkey is less expensive. And there are definitely reputable IAHRS surgeons in Turkey that you can kind of choose from. But I think one of the biggest things to also keep in mind when you're looking for a surgeon is to just try not to fall for the flashy marketing. It's really tough because a lot of those surgeons, they'll put, their most successful patients on the front page of their website. They'll choose a lot of the time patients who have, very strong, ropey, dark hair, thick, dark hair. And they may post a picture of that person with a completely shaved head. And then they'll show the person 9 months later with a fully grown out, thick head of hair. And really the main goal of a lot of the, surgeons in Turkey, the ones that are, a lot of these surgeons in Turkey, they'll kind of team up with different influencers in the US, in Europe, and Turkey, to try to get them to promote, their clinic. But here's the thing to kind of consider about these clinics in Turkey that kind of churn out a lot of people and do all the flashy marketing. Something to think about is when they're working on a celebrity, let's just say Logan Paul goes to get a hair transplant, and they're going to make sure that they try to give him the best result possible. Because if Logan Paul goes and gets a really good hair transplant, he's going to broadcast that to his millions of fans to go to that same clinic. But if you're just Tom Brown or John Smith, from Oklahoma, from Kansas, those same doctors, they look at you as just a number, and they may not concentrate on giving you the best result possible. They may still try to do a good job, but if they have a lot of other cases that same day, they may not give you the same attention as they would give, an influencer that just happens to go to their clinic and that they're partnering with. You ideally want to choose a doctor, that really, really cares about the patient, is an expert in the field, and tries to do the best work they possible for every patient. So you really want to try to avoid the clinics that advertise, I don't want to say the most, but if you have a clinic and you have, let's just say, you have a clinic and they specialize in rhinoplasties and other surgeries outside of hair transplants, I found that for both hair transplant surgeons that worked on me, they just did hair transplants. And I think when a doctor just does hair transplants, they're a specialist, and they do hair transplants every single day, and they tend to have a team of dedicated, workers who know what they're doing, as opposed to, say, a surgeon who, does a rhinoplasty one day, does a facelift the next day, does Botox, does fillers, and then maybe, a couple times a week for a few hours, he might do a hair transplant. I think this is something that you really need to really consider and look at, because going to the wrong surgeon can be devastatingly expensive, not just for your wallet, but for the health of your head, health of your hair going forward. So I think this is the most important step after everything else I've spoken about, is make sure you find the right doctor, and make sure when you're interviewing these doctors, you kind of have to get a good gauge of their character. And it's really hard to do, in a 15-20 minute consultation. But, look for, most of your consultations are going to be, virtual nowadays. They might be on Zoom, or if they're in person, like really look the doctor in the eye and really ask them, questions on what they think would be most suitable for you, and really try to read them well. That's all I can say, is because some doctors, they may try to sell you the world, and once they get your money, they're going in and they're giving you a mediocre result. But that's where I think it's reading between the lines when you're in that consultation with the doctor, really trying to figure out, if they're a good person, and, if they're the right doctor for you. If you get a bad feeling about a doctor, it may not be worth it. You may want to conduct some more interviews. And even if you have to drive a couple hours more, or you have to hop on a plane, go to the other side of the US, or go to another country, listen to your gut on your feeling about the doctor, and just try to make the best decision possible. And I don't work in the hair transplant industry. I wouldn't consider myself an expert in hair transplants, but, feel free in the comments to ask me some questions. The reason I made this video is, when I was in my early 20s in college, I was devastated about my hair loss, and it's something that affected me for a really long time. And I just want someone out there who's going through the same thing to make more of an informed decision, especially on the first hair transplant, than I did, and go in with a game plan and a strategy, as opposed to seeing a video on YouTube and calling up the hair transplant clinic and asking them when you can get in for when the next spot is, like I did. The next step is really just comparing prices. It really comes down, a lot of it comes down to cost after you determine these other factors. So what I can say is hair transplants in the United States are typically going to be much more expensive in big cities like New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, mainly because the cost of living is higher there and the cost of doing business is higher. So if a hair transplant surgeon is renting a floor of the building, their rent might be higher in those cities than it would be in, Des Moines, Iowa, or, some other location in, the Midwest, as an example. But just because a hair transplant is cheaper doesn't always mean it's better. I know in Turkey, the average cost of a hair transplant is much, much lower than it is here in the United States. But this is where I really think taking a look at the surgeons in the IAHRS is going to really help you narrow down a qualified expert, who does hair transplants, and, kind of help you in making that decision, as opposed to going on Instagram and going on YouTube and being bombarded by all these hair transplant clinics just trying to get you in the chair and trying to make a fortune off of you at the end of the day. I think really the last step has to go with your mindset and preparation going into the procedure. So usually the hair transplant surgeon will give you a list of directions to follow before the hair transplant. Usually that consists of, making sure you're not taking certain medicines, You're well rested before the hair transplant. Sometimes they don't want you to exercise a few days before. And then going into the procedure that same day, there really needs to be some consistent time and focus on the doctor drawing the hairline, because this is going to be the hairline that you'll have for the rest of your life. And normally what the doctor will do is they'll take some measurements to make sure your thirds are going to be in similar proportions. And he's going to draw you a hairline that is going to be where he feels is going to kind of fit your whole face. But this is where you really need to chime in, and you really need to tell them if you're comfortable or not. If you're looking for more of a straighter hairline, or you're looking for a hairline that's, maybe you want a little bit of recession in the hairline and the doctor wants to lower it a little bit, this is where you really need to stand up and say, tell him how you feel. Say things like, no, I'd rather have the hairline a little bit higher, or I'd rather have the hairline a little bit lower. And then the doctor needs to tell you his professional opinion on whether he thinks that's a good idea or not. Because once they place those grafts in your hairline, that's going to be the hairline. If you just have one procedure, that's going to be the hairline you're going to have for your entire life. So you're going to have to be comfortable with that. And yeah, once you're comfortable with the hairline, the doctor is usually going to give you some medicine to relax you, and then he's going to start the procedure. Well, I'm hoping that this information is valuable for you. If you did find it valuable, feel free to give it a like. Feel free to comment down below your experience with hair transplants. Let me know what you're thinking, whether you're thinking about getting a hair transplant, this year, next year, in the future. Feel free to use me as a resource. I try to answer every comment and get back to everybody. I know it's tough sometimes with work, but I'm always here to provide an opinion. If you ever need it. And yeah, feel free to subscribe. And until next time, take care.